Welcome everyone. Today, we're diving into an exciting what-if scenario set in the Naruto universe. The story is called What If Naruto, the Fateful Uchiha? By Milexcore. If you're intrigued by this amazing tale, be sure to check out the full story through the link in the description. On the night of October 10th, Jun did not sleep. He stayed awake, dressed, and ready to move out. He acted like he was reading a book while he was looking through his window anxiously. He heard his parents talking in the living room and sensed the chakra of his sister in her room. She was sleeping. Everything was peaceful, but Jun was tense. He couldn't wait any longer. He wanted Kyuubi to appear right away. He was on high alert for any unusual chakra signature. He was confident he could pick up the huge chakra of the tailed beast from a distance. He suddenly felt like a bus hit him. Without warning, Kyuubi's chakra appeared out of nowhere. It was huge, overwhelming, burning, and inhuman. Jun couldn't breathe. He gasped. The book fell from his hands. That moment felt like an eternity, as if everything was moving in slow motion. Kyuubi's chakra was dense. In the living room, the whispers of his parents stopped. He heard his mom calling his name. Simultaneously, a deafening roar tore through the night. Time resumed its normal flow. His mother burst into his room. She was pale. Jun looked at her in horror. His mind went blank, and it took him a few seconds to regain his senses. The shelters. "We must go to the shelters," he said. The alarm sounded. In the confusion, Jun could not remember how they had gotten out of the house. They were currently in the streets, running to the nearest shelter. Izumi was crying. She was terrified and shaking. A handful of other people came out of their homes. Some were terrified, others were perplexed. They had yet to comprehend what was happening. Jun looked as he ran and almost tripped himself. The Nine Tails was gigantic. It was more massive than the cliff that dominated the village. The beast seemed so close. It hit the ground with its feet, and houses flew away. Kyuubi was conceivably 10 blocks away. There weren't even in the path of the rubble, but some debris rained down on them. Panic took over. People started screaming. The instructions of the ninjas were lost in the terrified cries of the civilians. Kyuubi roared again in fury. Jun felt the sound travel throughout his body. He stumbled, someone pushed him, and he found himself swallowed by the crowd. He had lost sight of his parents. It was one of his worst nightmares. He ran without knowing where he was going, overwhelmed by a visceral fear. He experienced the terror of a prey confronting its greatest predator. It wasn't only the size of the creature that made it so terrifying. A shinobi could freeze an opponent by letting out a murderous intent using chakra. It was a principle everyone knew. However, this wasn't a ninja enemy or another human being. It was a force of nature fully unleashed, filled with rage and hatred. Its chakra was raging. It was infused with murderous intent so intense it could freeze your blood. Jun ran aimlessly, driven by fear. He had no idea where his family was. He used his elbows to make way, but his movements were clumsy due to fear. The fact that he lost his family added to his despair. He had vowed to protect them. There was a sudden explosion, and Jun was thrown backward. He rolled over, got up, and froze. About 30 meters from his position, something had pulverized the landscape. There were corpses in the streets, smashed to the ground by the force of the explosion. Some were launched in the air and were impaled on debris. People were yelling. Jun's ears were still ringing. He wobbled, stunned. He turned around and realized with a shock that the street behind him was no more. He saw more bodies. Jun forced his legs to move. He had to go to the shelter, to safety. Jun heard a sound and saw the remnants of a building flying through the air. He began running. The debris crashed to his left, and he felt the impact shaking the ground. The cloud of dust raised by the impact rushed into the street like an avalanche. Jun threw himself behind a wall, avoiding the shockwave. He no longer knew where he was. The landscape had changed. The familiar buildings were demolished. How long had it been since the appearance of Kyuubi? 1 minute? 5 minutes? 10 minutes? He had no idea. Time had become irrelevant. A panicked crowd ran down an adjacent street. There were people crying out for help, others were desperately calling out the names of loved ones. Some were simply screaming in terror. Then another big impact shook the ground so violently Jun fell to the floor. There was silence. The screams died down. The Ninetales roared again. I have to move. If I stay here, I'm dead. I have to move, I must move, 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 move. His body no longer obeyed him. His muscles were petrified in fear. He was shaking and breathing unevenly like a cornered animal. He felt tears streaming down his cheeks. He could not move. A primitive part of his brain had taken control and reasoned that by not moving, the predator wouldn't slay him. But Jun knew better. There was no stopping Kyuubi's rampage. He must move. Jun perceived something over him. He looked up and recognized the head of Ninetales above the collapsed buildings. The beast wasn't closer than the last time he caught a glimpse of him, but it didn't need to be near him to cause some serious damage. Jun saw its shoulders, its back, and its tails moving like snakes under the full moon and casting huge 9 shadows over the village. Kyuubi turned toward the other side of the village. He saw the muscles in its shoulders move, his paw crashing down several blocks away and shaking the ground. The monstrous head of Kyuubi swiveled. It was unbelievably swift for a creature its size. He saw his chin, his jaws were gaping open. When the beast spun around, he saw his eyes, red eyes. They radiated hatred. The gaze passed over the street without sighting him. He felt like an insignificant insect. He was so close to making eye contact with such a creature that his instinct kicked in. Jun came back to his senses. It was like he had been seeing the world in black and white and now colors returned. His vision became clear. His muscles freed themselves from their paralysis. He found himself able to move. He turned in the opposite direction to the Ninetales and took off. He did not run, he sprinted. He had never run so fast in his life. Adrenaline was kicking in. He went through the debris, his muscles filled with chakra. Each of his strides covered more distance than the previous one. He moved so fast that his vision got blurry. But he still perceived everything clearly, the specks of dust, the small stains of blood. He omitted nothing. Kyuubi roared behind him. He felt the breath of a new wave of destruction pass through his back. He did not turn around. He ran even faster. His fear gave him wings. The shelter was no longer in his mind. He was merely running in the opposite direction of the threat. He passed through devastated areas, ruins, and corpses. He saw some streets that have yet to get destroyed but did not stop. Jun! Jun! He recognized his father's voice. The fear clouding his mind evaporated, and he stopped running. Dad? He called. A figure leaped from a roof and ran after him. Renzo emerged from the smoke and dust. He was covered in mud, and the front of his uniform was smeared with bloodstains. His father opened his arms and ran to him. Jun also threw himself into his arms. Renzo hugged his son tightly for a brief moment, overwhelmed with emotions. Then, he forced Jun back and examined him attentively. Are you hurt? The explosion separated us. Your mother and sister are not with you? Jun's relief disappeared. He shook his head, his throat was dry. He identified several expressions on his dad's face: surprise, shock, terror, doubt, resignation, and determination. Everything happened rapidly, but he saw it so clearly. It was like he was seeing in slow motion. Renzo opened his mouth to speak, then froze. With a delicate gesture, he put his hand on Jun's face and looked at him. The Sharingan, he said in a low voice. Jun blinked cluelessly. His mother was an Uchiha. He was half Uchiha. Therefore, he possessed the potential to awaken the Sharingan. He just never thought about it before. It explained how his vision was so much better in the last few minutes. The amount of detail he was able to discern and process was abnormal. A loud explosion shook the ground, and a wave of burning dust washed over them. His father instinctively moved to shield him. For a moment, they stood still, waiting for the shockwave to pass and the wind to die down. They could still hear Kyuubi's roar ripping through the streets and buildings, but they couldn't see it. The creature was hidden from them by the surrounding ruins. Renzo looked around, then stepped away from his son. "We can't stay here. It's too dangerous. The route to the first shelter was destroyed, you have to go to the second shelter. Do you know the way?" Jun's mind went blank for a brief moment. He knew the way, he had memorized the route to every shelter. He knew the streets to take, the landmarks to follow, the trees for the shortcuts. But the landscape was altered now. There were no more streets, no more houses, no trees, nothing but debris on the ground. How could he find his way? Jun's training kicked in. He remembered he was a ninja. He had other ways to orient himself. He could also sense the chakra of the people guarding the entrance of the shelter. The teenager nodded to his father. The latter seemed relieved. He rose to his feet, dragging his son with him. Jun realized with amazement that his legs were shaking so much he had trouble regaining his balance. But his father didn't give him time to regain his composure. They kept running amid the screams, explosions, Kyuubi's roars, and falling debris. Renzo led the way. Jun had the impression of following blindly with no idea of where they were. The landscape was no longer familiar to him. An explosion hit what was left of the street, sending screaming people, electric poles, tiles and rubble flying several meters away. Jun leaped up. His dad managed to cling to a wall with his chakra and grabbed his son's hand just in time. He felt his wrist twist violently and let out a painful cry. The blast passed. Renzo released him, and he landed on his feet with a muffled moan. He was clutching his injured wrist. His legs were still shaking. He struggled to remain on his feet. He was in pain, tired and scared. He just wanted the whole thing to stop. But he knew what he desired was irrelevant before the Ninetales rampage. The beast's chakra was suffocating. The night was filled with cries of anguish and loud explosions, forming a gruesome symphony. Someone called for help a few meters away. Jun realized later his father had been passing by injured people and corpses without looking back. This time, it was a high-pitched and terrified voice. It belonged to a child. Renzo turned around. He found himself on the other side on the street in an instant. He hunched over a small figure buried under a pile of tangled beams. Jun could see the features of a little girl through the dust and blood. Her hair was black, maybe dark red or purple. He couldn't tell exactly. She was shaking all over. Jun believed she had been stuck there for a while. The girl was around Izumi's age. Renzo started waving hand seals for Doton to help him lift the wooden beams trapping the child. Jun took a couple of timid steps in their direction to help. There was another explosion, and Jun was violently thrown in the air. He couldn't differentiate up from down for a moment. He was getting blown away like a twig in a tornado. Then, he suddenly saw the ground approaching. He braced himself and rolled to soften the impact. His shoulder hit the ground hard. He let out another painful cry that was engulfed by the cloud of sand, dust and ash raised by the explosion. He tried to stabilize himself by grabbing the ground using his chakra. The seconds felt like an eternity as he tried to stop his momentum. Pieces of wood, stones, tiles and metal flew through the air like shards of shrapnel. He closed his eyes, hoping not to be hit by a piece of debris. The wind died down. Jun blinked, haggard. He stumbled to his feet. His ears were ringing, the sound seemed muffled to him. Kyuubi appeared to be much further away. Was he thrown away that far? It didn't look like it. The Ninetales was now outside the village walls, leaving behind a trail of destruction. Small gnat-like shadows circled around the tailed beast. They were pushed away by its angry paws. The Konoha shinobis were trying to contain the calamity and keep him away from the village. Dad? Jun's head was spinning, but his Sharingan was still active. Everything he perceived was extremely clear, very detailed and searing into his memory like a hot iron: the crumbling houses, the charred beams pointing upward, the fallen trees, the shattered walls, the bodies on the ground. Stones had rained down on the street like meteorites, leaving huge impacts. No one was moving. No one screamed for help. Jun was the only figure advancing in this field of ruins. He sensed no other chakra except his own. His heartbeat quickened. He refused to believe it. His dad always came back. He couldn't imagine this time would be different. His father was not dead when he found him. The pile of beams he was trying to move had collapsed. The neighboring building had also fallen on it. Jun no longer saw the little girl that Renzo had tried to help. There was only a small pale hand and fingers curved in a gesture of supplication. Renzo had been blown away by the explosion that pulverized the nearby buildings. He was lying a little further away from the girl's position. Jun couldn't see his whole body. It was practically covered by rubble. His arms and legs were twisted in at least 3 different places. He was staring at the sky with his eyes wide open. Jun would never forget that image. His father, so big and strong, was smashed to pieces like a broken toy thrown to the ground by a giant. He fell to his knees beside him. His mind was empty. Then, he felt his chakra. The familiar and reassuring sensation was now reduced to a flickering spark. Jun put his hand on his dad's shoulder, then his neck, terrified and unsure of what to do to help him. He couldn't move him, he didn't know how to heal him. But he had to do something. He couldn't just sit there and watch him die. Help! Please! Someone, anyone! Help! He cried. No one came. There was no one else alive on that street. No matter how he desperately looked for a sign, an ally, anything, there was no one. It was just him and Renzo, who was barely breathing. His voice cracked, and Jun stopped screaming. His breathing was choppy. His sobs made it difficult for him to breathe. He had almost no chakra left and was exhausted. There was nothing he could do. It was like sinking into a nightmare without being able to wake up. He had never felt so alone, so helpless, so weak. His father's chakra was dwindling like the flame on a dying candle. His eyes were already blurry. He couldn't see his son anymore. Renzo was barely breathing. With each breath, Jun heard the faint gurgling of his lungs filled with blood. He saw his eyelids quivering, and he leaned over him, panicked. Dad! Stay with me. Help is coming. I'll get you out of here. His father reacted to the sound of Jun's voice. An affectionate expression briefly passed over his face before being driven away by the pain. His lips were quivering. Talking was beyond him, but Jun leaned over anyway. His father was trying to tell him something. Jun didn't want to miss his words. Jun! Dad? Renzo closed his eyes. His chakra went out like a candle at the end of its wick. His chest stopped heaving. Jun remained motionless for a moment. He couldn't believe it. He refused to believe it. The scene burned into his memory down to the smallest detail: the blood, the dust suspended in the air, and the utter stillness of his father's face. Ultimately, he couldn't deny reality. That reality was like a giant hand clutching his throat and crushing his heart. His hands clenched convulsively on his father's jacket. He was having trouble breathing. He felt like his head was going to explode. The scene was so clear in his mind. It was too much. He couldn't see and feel this again, all the horror, the grief, the rage, the despair and the pain. The emotions came crashing into him. He felt like he was going to break. Jun was having a severe headache. The pain in his head, which was concentrated solely behind his eyes, seemed to explode along with his grief. Jun couldn't take it anymore, and he screamed. He sounded like a mortally wounded animal, like he was going crazy. He kept screaming until his vocal cords gave out. He pulled his hair. His screams turned into dry and painful sobs. He felt like he was losing his mind. He wanted everything to stop. Jun felt his last strength disappear, blown away by the tornado that was his emotions. He felt empty inside but welcomed it. Emptiness was better than the pain that ripped through his chest. He finally reached his limits and let the darkness hug him. Jun fainted. There was a distant conversation, a shocked cry. Jun was carried with care. He didn't wake up. He moaned softly but kept his eyes closed. He didn't have the strength to open them. He was exhausted. Moreover, if he woke up, he would have to accept a cruel reality. He wasn't ready for it, not yet. He allowed himself fall asleep again. Jun vaguely sensed a new, soothing chakra moving over his wrist, shoulders, the cuts on his arms and cheeks. He had no idea he was injured so badly. He felt a firm mattress against his back and heard the regular beeping of machines. His mother's voice came to his ears. It was a mix of anger and sadness. Jun also sensed the chakra of his little sister. The latter was squeezing his hand. He took all that in but did not wake up. His fatigue was immense. Hours or days passed. Jun wasn't sure. He navigated between dream and reality. He was somehow aware of his surroundings without fully being awake. He often sensed the chakra of the people moving around him. His mother and sister were there almost every day. Iruka and Yugo also came to visit him. There were many strangers as well. Jun was a bit surprised. He didn't think his sensory abilities were so precise. It took him a while to wake up. He had no memory of when he first opened his eyes. Everything seemed distant and blurry to him. Had his mother really been there, sitting next to the bed with tears in her eyes, or had he imagined it? Where was he? It wasn't his room. Was he still dreaming? Jun gradually emerged from his coma. That was the term they told him. Apparently, he was in a coma for 2 weeks. The nurses told him he was lucky. He had exhausted his chakra. Many people would have died from it. When he was brought to the hospital, they weren't sure he would make it. His mother and his sister came to see him. They told him how much they had missed him. Jun learned that 15 days had passed since the appearance of Kyubi. The funerals had taken place. His father was dead. Their house had been destroyed. Hazuki's parents had offered to host them, and she accepted. They were going to be part of the Uchiha clan now. His mother seemed nervous as she told Jun the story. She knew how her son felt about her parents. She was expecting him to protest. But Jun did not react. It worried his mom even more. Jun hadn't forgotten about the massacre. But he didn't have enough energy to care about it now. He felt empty. His dad was gone. The rest seemed unimportant. They released Jun 3 days later. The hospital experienced a shortage of beds. They couldn't afford to keep him any longer. Jun left with his mom and sister. They were both holding his hands as they walked. The village still bore the signs of the attack. There were ruins, battered streets, and damaged buildings. However, the reconstruction had already begun. There were carpenters all over the streets. The walk was longer than he remembered. It seemed like the police station and the clan buildings also suffered from the attack. The Uchiha clan had moved to another location. A couple in their 60s was waiting for them. "Here we are," his mother announced nervously. "Father, mother, this is my son, Jun. These are my parents, your grandparents. Seishi Uchiha and Nao Uchiha." She introduced. Jun stared at them. Seishi had a stern face, a receding hairline, and was leaning on a cane. Nao had the same face as her daughter Hazuki, piercing eyes, and long grey hair tied in an intricate bun at the back of her neck. They bore the Uchiha emblem on their clothes. They were his grandparents, yet Jun felt nothing towards them. He was completely indifferent. His mother's hand tightened on his, as a warning. Jun got the message and bowed automatically. He was the very image of an obedient and well-behaved child. "It's a pleasure to meet you." They exchanged some pleasantries, then Seishi and Nao accompanied them home. They had a big house. Nao told them it was smaller than the previous one they owned. Jun remembered her mom had mentioned they lost uncles, aunts, brothers, sisters, and cousins in the previous war. It was no wonder they had a huge house. Jun also understood the reason they wanted to get close to Hazuki's children now. Jun and Izumi were the only grandchildren they had left. Jun's belongings, or the little that was salvaged after the disaster, had already been placed in the room next to Izumi's. He found a book on Fuinjutsu whose pages were damaged. It was the unique book that survived. There was a futon bed in the closet, along with some new clothes. Jun turned away. He wondered how life could have changed so much in a short period of time. The family moved in with the Uchihas, and life went on. It was probably easier for Izumi since she was still young. She could adapt faster. Initially, she cried a lot. With time, she managed to forget the pain. Their mother grieved longer. She was having a hard time dealing with it since she wasn't doing much. She decided to come out of retirement and return to active duty. Konoha was short on ninjas anyway. She received her old rank of Chunin back and wore the green jacket all the time. Moreover, she was actively participating in the Uchiha's relocation, which would take many months. She was home late. When her parents told her it wasn't good for the kids, her smile would freeze, and her eyes would turn cold. So, no one said a thing about it anymore. Jun mourned too. It took him several days to come out of his state of shock and emptiness. He did not cry with his sister or mother. He cried with his friends. Iruka had lost his parents during the attack. He endured the same pain. It was heartbreaking but also liberation to let his tears out. After he cried, fatigue settled in. He felt better. He wanted to be angry. Truth be told, he was a bit upset. He was mad at Kyubi, at Toby for unleashing the Nine Tails in the village, at the Yondaime for not being fast enough, and at everyone for not saving his father. But the feeling was brief. What's the point? It won't bring my father back. It just brings me more pain. He would have liked to blame someone, to be able to hold someone responsible, to have someone to hate. But he knew better. It wouldn't make things any easier, and he wasn't that type of person. He cherished his mother and little sister, and even this messed up village. He treasured them, and that feeling kept him going. It would have been so much easier to let himself be consumed by hatred and rage. But he wanted to heal. He missed his father, but he would move forward. His dad would have wanted him to keep marching onward. The academy reopened, and the students returned. The children were quiet the first few days. Everyone was dealing with the trauma at their own pace. Some were still in shock. Others were crying. A few were aggressive and angry, and other children were suffering in silence. Jun, Iruka, and Yugao stuck together. They all experienced the loss of someone dear. Iruka's parents were gone. Yugao would never see her mother and little brother. Her father was also gravely injured. He would never be a ninja again. Compared to them, Jun was better off. He only lost his dad. On the other hand, he was the only one who saw a loved one perish. He still remembered it. Jun did not talk about it. He would live with it until the gaping wound in his heart hurt less. He experienced many phases of the grieving process, from denial and anger to depression. With time, he realized the grief was no longer as unbearable as it used to be. The explosive trio began to fracture. Yuga no longer had anyone to train her in Kenjutsu. She started to exercise on her own at night. She had no desire to play and joke around anymore. Iruka was different. He hated the orphanage, the indifference of the adults, the loneliness, and the grief. He started acting up and getting himself in trouble to draw attention to his person. Jun tried to stay close to them. He tried to keep Yugao company and listen to Iruka. But that wasn't enough. He couldn't give them back what was permanently taken away from them. Jun's grades had dropped. He no longer had the drive to perform well in class. He also lacked focus during the taijutsu lessons. He went down in the ranking before stabilizing his position in the middle of the pack. He was still a gifted ninja. Thinking about it reignited a spark of pride in his chest. His dad has taught him a lot. He wanted to make him proud. The weeks passed, the pain became less suffocating. He learned to live in his father's absence, in their new home with his new family in a village in reconstruction. He still missed Renzo, but he was moving forward. The Uchihas weren't mean, but they weren't welcoming either. They were a little rigid, easily offended, and always on the defensive. It didn't help Jun fit in. He mostly talked to his family, and it was tense. He wasn't as close to his mother as before. Izumi was still a child. The relationship with his grandparents wasn't good either. Therefore, he avoided being at home whenever he could. He hardly associated with children his age within the clan, contrary to Izumi who made friends last year. Jun had stayed away. And now, he felt alone. He still had his friends from the academy, but they didn't hang out together after class anymore. He missed it. Fortunately, the library survived Kyuubi's rampage. Jun went back to his good old habits and began to borrow a bunch of books. Everyone healed from their wounds as time passed. Iruka still acted up, and Yugao continued to train alone. However, the explosive trio still shared precious bonding moments. Jun started to work on his ninjutsu again. It was knowledge passed on to him by his father. Izumi was also doing well. She didn't hide her admiration for Itachi. Especially when the latter was so talented, and he had advanced 3 classes at once. Their mother began to spend more time at home. She smiled more often. Jun realized it had been 4 months since the Ninetales assault on the village. The school year was nearing its end. "I'm going to take the final exam," Yugao announced to her friends. It was no surprise. She and Jun had thought about taking the exam together at the beginning of the year, and now, that wasn't certain. Jun had a decent level, but his grades had gone down. He wasn't confident about the exam. He could pass it or fail beautifully. "You should." "I will wait until next year," Jun said with a faint smile. Iruka nodded. "I'm waiting too. We might be on the same team," he said. Jun hoped so. Yugao nodded. "I'll probably end up on the same team as Aiz or Fujitaro. They're also taking the exam. They have a good chance of passing it." "What a pain," Yugao complained. "You could end up with the first of the other class." "I believe his name is Takao Uchiha," Jun said. "Another Uchiha. They are everywhere." "No offense to you," Yugao replied. "None taken. It's weird for me too. I'm not used to it." Jun was having a hard time adapting to his new name. He was Jun Uchiha now. "I don't know this Takao. If he's a year above us, he must be 11 or 12 years old. He shouldn't be worse than Fujitaro." Jun shrugged his shoulders. "I never saw it, but the rumors say he has already awakened his Sharingan. So, he probably thinks he's a big deal." "Sharingan? I think it's overrated." Jun's smile froze a little, but he expertly hid it. He hadn't activated the dojutsu since the attack. In fact, he hadn't told anyone he had awakened the Sharingan. He never thought he would be able to do it since he was only half Uchiha. He hadn't thought about it after his father's death. He had placed the matter in the back of his mind. There were some instances where he felt like the special eyes would appear again. In his moments of rage or stress, he felt his chakra circulating in his skull and converging towards his eyes. He had to make a conscious effort to disrupt the flow of energy. He did not want the Sharingan to activate. However, he knew that sooner or later, he would have to give in. How else was he to learn to utilize it? Jun wasn't sure if he should tell anyone about his new power. On one hand, it would be useful to have some guidance from an Ucha. On the other hand, it would draw attention to him. The more he thought about it, the more he believed that remaining silent was the best move. Moreover, he had no friends among the Uchihas. Who knew how they would take the news? Furthermore, he hadn't forgotten about the upcoming massacre of the clan. He was part of the clan now, but he was determined to find a way to distance himself and his family from the Uchihas. If he revealed the fact that he possessed the Sharingan, the clan would never let him go. But he couldn't just ignore it. That evening, he decided to take the bull by its horns. No more delaying the inevitable. He closed the curtains, locked the door, and sat down in front of his mirror. He infused some chakra in his eyes. When he opened his eyelids, his reflection stared back at him. He saw two tomos slowly swirling in his scarlet eyes. He raised his hand to his eyes. Two tomos. I thought there was only one that appeared at first. Were there some exceptions? Jun didn't know what it took to unlock the next tomo. Everything had happened so fast when he first awakened the Sharingan. He remembered seeing and discerning things clearly. The sensation got stronger and his vision got better. Maybe it was another tomo forming. The situation was so chaotic and so intense back then that he had apparently drained his chakra. He frowned as a strange suspicion was sprouting in his mind. He had used up his chakra. According to what he recalled from Naruto, it only happened when one cast jutsu after jutsu or utilized a big technique consuming an insane amount of chakra. But he could tell now that the Sharingan's chakra cost wasn't that severe. He could keep it on for a while without suffering from a lack of chakra. Therefore, the Sharingan couldn't have used up all his energy. It hadn't been activated long enough for that. Jun tried to recall that night again. He merely felt that his strength was leaving him when... No. It couldn't be. His suspicion turned into certainty. His breathing quickened. He swallowed with difficulty. Then, he gradually increased the amount of chakra flowing through his eyes. The two tomos grew and expanded. They became black bands that crossed and joined, forming a 4-point symbol resembling a stylized cyclone that was slowly spinning on itself. His chakra expenditure immediately skyrocketed. Jun, alarmed, shut his eyes and stopped infusing his chakra into them. No more energy was consumed. He kept his eyes closed for several seconds as a precaution. It was also a way for him to process what had just happened. Then, he exhaled deeply and slowly opened his eyelids. In the mirror, his eyes were now normal. It was as if he had imagined the whole thing. But he knew better. He had clearly seen it before closing his eyes. The image was burned to his mind. He had seen the reflection of his Mangekyo Sharingan. Damn, he sighed. The end of the year arrived with a normal exam. He was satisfied when he saw his results. His grades went up. However, he decided not to take the academy's final exam for early graduation. That decision led to some outcomes. Yuga passed him, as did a handful of others from his class. To everyone's surprise, Itachi Uchiha passed the final exam as well and became genin as 7 years old. He was as tall as Izumi. Jun thought it was crazy to allow him to graduate. The boy was only 7. Yes, he was probably excellent at killing people, but that shouldn't be all. Jun kept his indignation to himself. Sharing it with his family was a bad idea. Izumi was impressed by Itachi. Seishi and Eneo were also happy. Jun suspected it was more because of Izumi's interest in Itachi. Moreover, his mother was glad that Izumi got to spend some time with the young Uchiha at the academy. Jun did share his concerns with his two friends. They did not react as strongly as he, so the teenager dropped the matter. They promised to spend more time together in the future. Yuga had graduated, but Iruka and Jun still had a year left. Well, it could potentially be more if they failed the exam. But the chances of that occurring were slim. The explosive trio was separated. Yuga needed to spend time with her team, consisting of 2 other genins older than her and a jonin who would lead, guide, and train them. Iruka and Jun spent more time together. They made more explosive tags. Iruka was planning to utilize some for a few of his pranks. Jun politely declined his invitation to join him. He decided to read and train instead. He was discreetly trying to acquire books about the Sharingan. Unfortunately for him, the Uchihas didn't leave such manuals in the library. He only found basic information everyone knew. Jun kept up with his taijutsu and ninjutsu. He didn't use the Sharingan during his training. As for the Mangekyo Sharingan, he limited himself to 1 use monthly with the conditions that his chakra reserve was full and to never exceed 2 minutes with it activated. Jun didn't really want to use his dojutsu. But it was there, and he must do something with it. He also knew little about the Mangekyo Sharingan. Each one has its own shape. Itachi's Mangekyo would resemble a 3-pronged shuriken. Sasuke's one would look like a flower or a star with 6 points. Shisui's dojutsu was the only one he knew that had 4 prongs, like his. But it didn't mean that their ocular abilities were the same. That being said, they could be related. Things changed at the academy. Ice Hyuga had also graduated by passing the final exam. Fujitaro Uchiha was still in their class. He was telling everyone willing to listen that his parents had forbidden him to take the exam to not overshadow Itachi. Jun had another hypothesis. If Fujitaro happened to fail the final exam while the 7-year-old Itachi passed it with flying colors, it would definitely bring shame to his parents. They would develop an inferiority complex toward Itachi's parents. That was the way the Uchihas reasoned. Without Yugao, Jun and Iruka paid less attention in class. Iruka was always the type to slack off a little. But now, Jun was doing the same. Without the healthy rivalry with Yugao, his motivation went down. Iruka had other things going on in his life. He could leave the orphanage and find a place for himself though he was still a young teenager. Jun remembered Naruto was also living by himself. The protocol to make that happen was simple. One condition was to study at the academy for at least 2 years. The other was to have the orphanage approve the demand if there were no legal guardians. The village provided allowances for those orphans until they become genins and started getting paid. In most cases, the orphans inherited some money from their parents. The village was in charge of it until they reached the age of majority. Jun thought they could all live together as roommates. But it was a dream he wasn't sure would become reality anytime soon. His mother wouldn't probably sign off on it. It was the last year of the academy. The instructors were more demanding. Taijutsu fights became fiercer. All types of blows were allowed, even the one under the belt. By this time, they expected the students to be comfortable with the 3 basic jutsus, Henj no Jutsu, Bunshin no Jutsu and Kawarimi no Jutsu. Moreover, they were placed under Genjutsu until they escaped the illusion. There were many complex situations presented to them such as infiltration of enemy territory, fighting outnumbered or cases of treason. The students also carry out mini-missions in the forest for several days without the slightest comfort. They fought as a team, with handicaps, on unfamiliar terrains, and against friends. Jun felt like he wasn't wasting his time at the academy this last year. That feeling helped him bring his grades up. He hadn't trained in taijutsu with his mom since his father passed away. He trained on his own and started using his Sharingan when no one was looking. His reflexes improved considerably. Hitting Fujitaro during the sparring matches let him release all the frustration he had toward his grandparents and the Uchiha clan in general. Jun began to use jutsus taught by his father during team fights, sparring matches, or the mini-missions in the forest. The techniques were nothing flashy, a few D and C rank Raitun and Suitun jutsu. He resumed his training with Izumi as well. They hadn't done so since the death of their father. Jun was a bit apprehensive, but it was all in his head. Izumi was pleased to learn from her big brother. That evening after their training, their grandmother pointed out Izumi's dirty dress. The girl offered her an explanation of what they were doing and promised she would wear pants in the future when she trained. Reconnecting with Izumi boosted Jun's morale. He worked harder to strengthen his weaknesses. He no longer focused his energy on explosives tags, preferring utilizing it on taijutsu instead. He thought about going to Guy to ask him for tips. Recalling the man's personality, he pushed the idea aside. His temperament was a bit too intense for him. Finally, his hard work paid off. He beat Fujitaro Uchiha and took his first place spot. It was satisfying beating him. But he also drew attention to himself. His grandparents heard the news and praised him. During dinner, they brought forth a few girls' names they believed would be a good match for June. The latter merely ignored them. His grandfather mentioned he could work for the Konoha Police Department after his graduation. Jun lost his patience. He detested them trying to manage his life and future. He put his chopsticks on the table so abruptly that the dishes rattled. His grandpa fell silent, shocked. He glared at Jun as if reprobating him for his rude behavior. The teenager didn't care. He was fuming inside. He held Seishi's gaze while controlling his anger not to activate his Sharingan. His mother was alarmed. She was worried her son might go too far. Let me be clear. I, and I alone, decide on my future. I will not join the police. I will get married only and only when I desire to do so. I will choose the person I want to be with. You will not be consulted on the matter. Your opinion doesn't matter to me. I couldn't care less. Do not try to impose your beliefs and desire on me. Her grandparents were shocked. Jun was usually calm and never misspoke. They weren't expecting him to be so daunting. Izumi and Hazuki were also stupefied. I am a shinobi. I will serve the village and not your petty ambitions. Please keep your suggestions to yourselves in the future. The silence that followed was absolute. The air felt heavy as the tension was palpable. His grandfather was red with rage, and his grandmother's eyes were filled with fury. Jun ignored them and sat back down. He grabbed his chopstick and continued eating the rice as nothing happened. The silence ultimately broke. His grandparents and his mother were yelling at each other. Izumi looked at the scene with big eyes. Jun held back a nervous smile. He pretended to be calm while chewing his food. The truth was that his sweaty hands could barely hold onto the chopsticks. He almost regretted his outburst. Almost, because he was feeling good about it. He's been holding back for too long. He was prepared to face whatever would happen next. It took several minutes for the yelling to quiet down. Jun was finally able to understand what they were yapping about. Seishi was outraged by Jun's ingratitude and insolence. Eneo was upset her daughter hadn't raised her son well. Hazuki defended her son fervently. She blamed her parents for his outburst. Jun's heart warmed up seeing his mom looking after him. I will not tolerate being disrespected in my own house. Seishi spluttered. I believe my son was respectful. You pushed him too far. I told you he was not going to agree to it. Yet, you have ignored me and only did as you see fit. Too far? He should be honored to be part of the Uchiha clan. The least he can do is to contribute to the clan. Did he forget our generosity? Jun got up again. I am grateful to you for taking us in. I've brought no dishonor to the Uchiha name during my time here. On the contrary, I am at the top of my class. However, I will not give up my right to walk my own path for the Uchiha name. Foolish boy, we are giving you a path to walk on. I want to be a shinobi of Konoha, like my father Renzo. There was another silence. Their dad was never mentioned in this house before. It was some sort of implicit understanding Jun never understood. His father had become a taboo. Unlike me, Hazuki added in a soft voice. Seishi let out a grunt and looked at Jun. You're the same as your mother. You don't listen. Our lives would be easier if you just do what is expected of you. Jun was surprised his grandpa had given up so easily. Then, he realized it was because of his mom's intervention. They knew Hazuki well. She had left once and would not hesitate to leave again, for good this time. She was their only child still alive after the war. However, Jun decided to add a few drops of oil to the receding fire. Our lives would be easier if you let people make their own choices. The teenager retorted. His grandparents were the type who thought that they would eventually obtain what they demand if they keep pushing. It was a common attitude among rich, capricious, arrogant people. Jun should have opposed them sooner. It was the best way to deal with this type of individual. The longer you remain silent, the more comfortable they get. Look, Eneo began. Seishi raised his hand to interrupt his wife. He glared at Jun for a moment before opening his mouth. There are a few Uchihas who do not work for the police. There are other acceptable career choices. However, keep in mind that you are required to produce offspring for the clan. And that it's better if you choose a partner within the clan to strengthen the bloodline. Jun was tempted to reply fiercely. The look his mom gave him made him reconsider. The conversation was calming down. Maybe it wasn't wise to resume the hostilities. He gave his grandpa an icy smile. Your suggestion has been duly noted. Judging by the way Seishi's eyes narrowed, he got the implicit message behind his words. Jun was basically telling him, I would do as I like. They stared at each other for a few seconds. The Uchiha clan only accepts excellence. I want you to graduate first in your class. Jun couldn't believe the guy. Would it kill him if he didn't get to have the last word? The teenager decided to be the bigger man and let him have this illusory victory. He had already made his point. Jun's life radically changed since he had stood up to his grandparents and spoke his mind. Their relationship grew colder. They stopped harassing him to join the police department, but they became more demanding. They showed more interest in his grades at the academy. When Jun celebrated his birthday a week later, they didn't give him clothes or storybooks, but ninja gear. Seishi even took the time to teach him the Kaiten, Great Fireball Jutsu. He told Jun that learning this technique was a rite of passage for the Uchiha clan. One started to become respected once they mastered the jutsu. Jun took it as a sign that his grandparents were taking him seriously now. He respectfully listened to Seishi's instructions and succeeded in doing the jutsu on his second attempt. Somehow, what happened over that dinner spread like wildfire throughout the district. It was rare for an Uchiha child to go against parents or grandparents. All Uchihas were aware of Jun's attitude. Some adults approached him to reprimand him. A few others encouraged him to stay true to himself. His mother's attitude also changed. She stopped being more passive when people questioned her career choice and the fact that she did not remarry. Now, she didn't hesitate to tell them to mind their own business. Izumi was also affected by it. She looked at her big brother with newfound respect. She didn't think it possible to go against their grandparents until Jun did. Izumi was amazed. She spent more time with her brother. They trained and talked more. She opened up about her future, her life as a kunoichi, and the pressure of being a daughter of the Uchiha clan. It was the first time they engaged in such a deep conversation. There wasn't much about Izumi in the Naruto story, except that she was close to Itachi. Jun wanted her to go after dreams instead of following the status quo. His sister was now receptive to the message, and Jun was happy about it. The most significant change in Jun's life came several days later. A boy his age came to introduce himself. He was waiting at the exit of the academy. Hi. I don't know if you remember me, we were in the same class when we enrolled in the academy. I am Shisui Uchiha. Jun stared at the clan prodigy. He was among the youngest students to graduate from the academy. Shisui had the same age as Jun, but he was already at least a tune-in. Jun was surprised because the teenager had never spoken to him before. A second passed, then another. Shisui's beaming smile remained. Iruka pretended to crack his knuckles menacingly, taking a step forward. Is he bothering you, Jun? Iruka had no chance of defeating Shisui, but the friendship gesture touched Jun. He knew he could count on his friend in time of need. Jun shook his head. It's all right. I'm fine. See you later, Iruka. Iruka glared suspiciously at the Ucha before leaving. Jun waited for him to be a bit far away before turning to his interlocutor. He crossed his arms. I remember you. Why are you here? Did someone send you? Shisui pretended to be hurt by Jun's words. Is it weird that I want to spend time with my cousin? Definitely. You aren't going to fool me with that. Shisui laughed. Ah, you got me. Your grandmother sent me. I'm one of the few Uchihas who aren't in the police. She wants me to spend some time with you. She hopes I'd be a positive influence. Damn you, old hag. Jun squinted angrily. Why did you come clean about it? She never said it was a secret. And honestly, I am curious to know you. I did not want to start off with a lie. I'm not interested in knowing you, Jun replied. Shisui didn't give up. We could train together. I'm a Jonin, I could teach you a few things. How many Kaiten jutsus do you know? Jun hesitated. He was tempted. He solely knew the Great Fireball technique. Most of his jutsus were Raitun and Suitun, which he learned from his father. With his Ucha bloodline, he possessed a natural affinity with fire. It would be stupid not to add some Kaiten techniques to his arsenal. Moreover, it had been a while since he had trained with someone considerably stronger than him. Moreover, wasn't Shisui also gifted with the Shunshin no Jutsu? He wanted to master that technique. The academy had merely taught them the basics. All right. But you also need to answer my questions. Jun said. Shisui was happy to comply and gave him some answers. He had been a Jonin a few weeks ago. And it was true, they were cousins. Their grandmothers were sisters. It was how he knew Nao. He mentioned that his specialty was genjutsu, but he was also proficient in other areas, ninjutsu included. He agreed to teach him the body flicker technique and some shurikens techniques. Jun didn't want to get attached to Shisui. He knew the teenager would die in less than 7 years. But he couldn't reject the offer. After a few weeks of hanging out with him, Jun realized it was too late to turn back. Shisui was a decent person. He was always smiling and optimistic. And above all, he was incredibly kind. He was different from the other Uchihas he knew. Jun spent time with Iruka at the academy and joined Shisui sometimes after class to train. The Ucha had to go on missions frequently, so they couldn't meet often. He also trained other people. Jun guessed one of them was probably Itachi. Iruka was still wary of the Ucha, but Shisui's easygoing personality made him lower his guard little by little. His newfound cousin was an excellent sparring partner. He possessed a keen eye for detail, was patient, and was an overall competent teacher. He taught Jun a few C-rank Kaiten jutsus, to begin with. Once he displayed his ability to learn fast, Shisui got excited and taught him higher-level techniques. The Jonin also showed him some interesting shurikens and kunai techniques. Jun originally thought the Sharingan was necessary to master those, but he was wrong. Most of them just required good dexterity. Shisui always answered his questions. Jun found out he valued honesty a lot. But Jun was careful about his interrogations. He never brought up the Mangekyo Sharingan. He focused on getting information about the organization of the village, the police, and the relationship among the various clans. He did ask about the Sharingan, though. He believed it wouldn't be suspicious. They were both Uchihas. It was natural to be curious about the dojutsu. Jun made sure to phrase his questions in a way that wasn't giving away he already possessed it. Shisui told him that when an Ucha underwent a powerful emotional ordeal involving a person precious to them, a special form of chakra is released, affecting their optic nerves and transforming the eyes into Sharingan. Because of that, the Sharingan was also known as the tie that reflects the heart. At first, there was only one tomo on each eye. The more the eyes were trained, the more tomo they had until they developed 3 on each eye. Shisui even gave him a list of exercises the Uchiha practiced to improve their special eyes. There were mostly speed reading tests, observation games, shuriken exercises, nothing too far-fetched. They also practiced taijutsu. Even though Jun preferred ninjutsu, he never said no to a good hand-to-hand combat. The academy no longer had challenging opponents for him. Fujitaro couldn't be considered an opponent anymore. Apparently, he was mad about it. When his rival Ai's Hyuga graduated, he thought he would become the best in the class. He never expected another challenger to appear out of nowhere and outshine him. Jun could felt some hatred from the young Uchiha. Therefore, he would deliver a good beating whenever he faced Fujitaro. He wanted to beat that hatred out of him. But the young Uchiha started to insult him. He called him half Uchiha and even said some nasty things about his father's side of the family. That made Jun angry. Anything related to his father was a sensitive topic. He also realized that most Uchihas didn't see him as part of the clan. He only received the surname but wasn't really accepted. Even though he wanted to maintain his distance from the clan in order to not be associated with the massacre, he was a bit jealous. He envied other Uchiha children. The clan was a big family that made you feel special only if you are fully accepted in it. It was a pity he couldn't save them from their fate. What would they think if they knew their extinction would come from the hands of one of their own? It was something Jun often asked himself. It was challenging for Jun to find time to train his Sharingan in secret. Now that he had openly opposed his grandparents, people paid more attention to him. The fact that Shisui often kept him company did not help. But he still had his freedom. He cut back on his reading time to make time for the dojutsu training. He had yet to unlock the 3rd tomo, but he was considerably better with using his eyes. The chakra expenditure was greatly reduced, and he was used to the vision offered by the Sharingan. Jun had activated his Mangekyo twice since the last time in front of the mirror. And it was weird. No instructions came with it, but he felt that he knew how to use it. It was as if the knowledge was already inside him and all he needed was a little push to access it. The last time he activated the Mangekyo, he tested it on a plant. It worked. And on the first try, nonetheless. It consumed a huge amount of his chakra, though. It had taken him some time to recover. Jun understood why the Uchihas with the Mangekyo Sharingan were intoxicated with power. It felt so natural, almost innate. All this power and its perfect mastery were available in the blink of an eye. Jun comprehended the reason the Mangekyo attracts and fascinates. His Mangekyo's power was Shikigami. It was a form of defensive ability that could be used offensively. It showed where to strike and the location of the weakness that could bring down a whole structure. Jun had utilized it on a bush, but it could work to break on a wall, a formation, an attack, a genjutsu, or even a person. That was what Jun thought. He wasn't certain. He probably wouldn't be able to use it in combat for a while anyway, not without passing out the next second. Shikigami was the only power of his eyes that he knew of. Perhaps there was another one, he wasn't certain. Some Mangekyo Sharingans had a different power in each eye, he knew it from his memories of Naruto. Itachi would have Tsukuyomi in one eye and Amaterasu in the other. But he seemed to be the only one in the series. Both of Shisui's eyes had the same power. Danzo would steal one eye, and Shisui would give the other to Itachi. Obito and Kakashi were also other examples. Their Mangekyo Sharingans were linked to the same dimension. However, Obito was able to send himself to the dimension as well as other things while Kakashi could only transport things he saw there. Jun was hopeful his eyes would possess another power. He liked his new routine. His grandparents were still cold, but they were easier to be around. They had found a balance in their behavior toward him. They accepted his decisions, and Jun gave them excellence. However, he knew it wasn't going to last. He was planning to move out as soon as he had enough money. He was looking forward to that argument when the time came. For now, he enjoyed the peace. There were 4 months left before the end of the school year when his routine was disrupted. It was in the middle of winter. A thick white carpet covered the village. At the academy, it was the time to have snowball fights. Jun and Iruka had fun. After class, Jun went to train while Iruka went to cause more trouble. That day, Shisui came. But he wasn't alone. A little boy was with him. "Jun, this is my cousin, Itachi." "I know him," Jun replied. Itachi was small. He was just 8 years old. He looked nothing like the adult Itachi in Jun's memory. But some signs were already there, the way he wore his headband, his grave expression. "I don't remember meeting you," Itachi said solemnly. His kid's voice made it so funny. Jun couldn't believe this little child would end the great Uchiha clan. "Izumi is my sister. She talks a lot about you. You have quite an effect on her." Itachi's eyes widened in surprise. For a brief moment, he looked like any ordinary kid his age. "Oh, I didn't know that," Shisui said, winking at Itachi. "We're just acquaintances," Itachi said. "Be nice to her. Do not hurt her, understood?" Jun warned. "Sure. Itachi wants to train. I thought it would be good for everyone to have various sparring partners. Both of you are probably tired of getting beaten by me." Shisui laughed. Jun wanted to inquire why Itachi didn't train with the genins in his team. But he remembered Izumi informing him that the young Uchiha had awakened his Sharingan on a mission. Jun didn't know all the details. It was also possible Itachi had already awakened his Sharingan and merely used the mission as an opportunity to reveal it. He wouldn't put it past the Uchiha. "I'm fine with it," Jun said. Itachi may be small, but he was a handful. Jun was clearly better in terms of brute strength, but the kid could pack some power. He was technically good, but it wasn't enough to overpower Jun objectively. They were evenly matched in taijutsu. Jun was happy about it for a brief instant before remembering the age of his sparring partner, who was 3 years younger than him. However, when they started using shurikens, Jun quickly found himself on the defensive. Itachi's pinpoint accuracy was a nightmare to deal with. Shisui later joined the fun. They fought a 3-way battle, then 2 against 1. The training ended with a chase in the trees to the other training ground. They eventually made their way back, walking through the entire Uchiha district together. They stopped to get some sweets on the way. Jun found out Itachi loved sweets. During the walk, Itachi maintained his serious expression the whole time. Even when Shisui and Jun were joking around, the young Uchiha maintained his composure. Jun found it a bit sad. It seemed he didn't know how to relax and have fun. That wasn't the only time Itachi joined Shisui and Jun for training. It happened again the next day, 3 days later, then the following week. Shisui was still training Jun privately, but he often arranged for Itachi to tag along. Over time, Shisui's students became familiar with each other. Itachi was still serious, but he started to relax a bit more. Jun was still wary of him because of what he knew, but he slowly got used to his presence in his life. Jun began to suspect that Shisui had arranged the whole thing so that he and Itachi could become friends. One day, he cornered Shisui and asked him. The Uchiha openly admitted it with a big smile on his face. He was truly shameless. Jun didn't want to be friends with Itachi. Their personality was different. Itachi was too quiet for him. Not to mention, he was the harbinger of destruction. Shisui argued that Itachi needed friends of a certain level because kids his age were too weak, and they couldn't bond with him. Jun refused to hear it. Shisui pleaded and begged. He only asked for Jun to train with him sometimes. He said the two could train together when Shisui was on a mission. Jun ended up giving in. He couldn't even explain why. Perhaps he was Shisui's plea, or maybe he felt bad for the lovely and under-pressured Itachi. Jun still made it clear to Shisui that his plans did not change. He didn't intend to remain close to the Uchiha clan. He had already hinted to Shisui about his desire to leave his grandparents' home. He wondered if he understood that he meant leaving the Uchiha district. After his class at the academy, Jun usually met with Itachi and Shisui. Sometimes it was just Shisui, other times it was just Itachi. Jun had noticed the Uchihas were more polite toward him when he was in the company of the two prodigies. Apart from that, no one in the clan spoke to him. That was fine with the teenager. He wanted out anyway. Though he was friends with Shisui and Itachi, he felt closer to Iruka and Jun. The reason Shisui came into his life was at the demand of his grandmother. Though he believed that his attitude towards him was genuine, he couldn't neglect that fact. As for Itachi, his future was reason enough to not be close to him. But he was spending more time with the Uchihas. Yugao wasn't really available to hang out, and Iruka was consistently getting in trouble with his pranks. He was even reprimanded once by the Sandaime Hokage. Therefore, after his class ended, he met with the Uchihas. If you were able to pass the final exam and graduate last year, why didn't you? Shisui asked one day. Itachi looked at her. Jun mentally cursed. He was being too open with them. I wasn't ready. He simply replied. You had the skills. Itachi pointed as he frowned, indicating his confusion. I wasn't mentally ready. It's not all about having skills. My father had died 6 months earlier. My state of mind wasn't good. There was a brief silence. Itachi had the good sense to look away. Some would argue it was a good reason to take the exam instead of postponing it. Becoming a genin would have allowed you to escape the situation. Shisui said. Shisui's father was ill. Everyone knew it. He was injured in the last war and never recovered from it. He was gradually losing his mind. It wouldn't have worked for me. I need to have a clear path with a clear goal in mind. I see. That's why you're always planning for things. You don't move without a purpose. Jun glared at him. I wasn't judging or criticizing you. He said with a big smile. They arrived at the intersection where they usually separated. Shisui lived near Itachi, and Jun was in the opposite direction. I have to go, Jun said. You sure? We still have time before it gets dark. Itachi nodded, agreeing with Shisui. I promised my sister I would spend some time with her. It's important for me. Training is important as well, Itachi said. Jun raised his eyebrows. He didn't expect to hear that from the person who would kill everyone except for his little brother. I can always train later. Izumi won't be 8 years old forever and want to hang out with me. He's got a point. You should do the same and hang out with Sasuke. I feel guilty taking you with me on the mission the other day. Shisui said to Itachi. Itachi looked surprised. Jun tried to recall Sasuke's age. He was probably 2 years old. He was no longer a baby. He understood some things. Shisui is right. I'm sure your brother would enjoy playing with you. Jun added. It's true. I'll be going then. See you tomorrow, he said to his friends. Itachi leaped away. Jun watched him jump from roof to roof. Shisui heaved an amused sigh. He doesn't go for what he really wants, does he? Jun asked. Shisui gave him a sharp look before softening his expression. Indeed. In a way, you and Itachi are two faces of the same coin. He still doesn't know his path. He better finds it quickly. The future of the clan depends on it. The way he is now, he could be easily manipulated. He's also isolated himself from kids his age. He's the perfect weapon. Jun thought. He suddenly felt mentally tired, considering the whole situation. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this chapter of What If Naruto, the Fateful Uchiha? Jun's journey is far from over, and there's so much more to come. If this video gets enough views, the next part will be on its way soon. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss any updates. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your feedback really matters. See you next time.